Hey everybody, Ivan here. A little bit of the off-the-cuff video today, so if it gets rambly at points, I'm sorry. But I wanted to get my thoughts all in one place on this subject now that it's sort of topical. I've touched on it multiple times in the past, but it's sort of dealing with the question of gunsmithing, who's a gunsmith and what's a gunsmith and how do you become a gunsmith and these sorts of things. This is topical now because people are finally becoming comfortable calling SDI a scam. I'll reserve my actual opinion on it, although I'm certainly not going to disagree and say that it isn't scammy, at the very least. We'll get more into that later, specifically, but what I wanted to do is try and get my thoughts out there as far as, right, the question I see asked constantly is, how do you become a gunsmith? And I know a lot of people have had a variety of different takes on this, and this is certainly not to discredit them or disagree with them, but just to get my thoughts out there about it. I do want to say, I have a hard time saying the G word, right, the gunsmith word, when talking about myself. I know that's kind of maybe funny because I've built a lot of guns, right? But calling yourself a gunsmith to me is sort of like calling yourself a physicist, where there's physicists that, like, they teach physics to high schoolers. And while some of them are, of course, like actual physicists, right, that could be doing actual physics, some of them like understand a physics textbook, and that's about it. And that may not be the perfect analogy, but what I'm trying to get to is that there's a lot of scope within gunsmithing, and my skill sets in some of those areas is like non-existent or very bad. Well, my skill set in some areas, like 3D printing, like it or not, is a big part of gunsmithing these days, and I've got 3D printing pretty well figured out. That sort of thing I've got a pretty good hold on. So I just sort of wanted to begin this conversation by talking about the sort of scope that actually is encompassed by when you say gunsmithing. Traditionally, back with your wood and steel guns, I think the scope was maybe less severe, where the sort of spread that you had was more or less the individual types of guns that you'd run into, and certainly that that amount of scope is still present today, and in fact is more extreme now. And even then was a substantial burden for gunsmiths to come across. Where I just set up two guns as an example. We've got an AR-15 and a 1911. From a standpoint of gunsmithing these days, these are probably the two most popular things that get messed around with. But even within 1911s, there's enough variants that you can have stuff that's 1911 or 1911 based or 1911 adjacent where there isn't parts compatibility. There's tomes that could be written just about the 1911 and just gunsmithing on the 1911. And you could be an expert on that and know nothing about AR-15s. Know nothing about repairing stocks on shotguns. Know nothing about any of this other stuff. So are you a gunsmith? Some people would say no, right? Some people would say, oh, all you know is 1911s, you're not a gunsmith. You couldn't fix an AR-15 that's short cycling, you're not a gunsmith. You only know 1911s. And there's a lot of no true Scotsmaning, I guess is what I'm getting to, that goes on around gunsmithing. I guess I gatekeep myself in that regard because I'm hesitant to call myself a gunsmith, but that's sort of my thoughts on that. Is a prefatory thing. So if we're defining gunsmith, I think gunsmithing involves any sort of work, repair, manufacture, fabrication that goes on with guns. This can be something as simple as replacing broken parts, fabricating new versions of broken parts, making the entire gun or parts of the gun from scratch, anything like that, right? I think falls into the umbrella of gunsmithing. And there's more extreme degrees of it and less extreme degrees of it, but from a standpoint of the gunsmithing that it is that people end up paying money for, it's usually not the making guns from scratch, and it's usually not even the making whole parts from scratch. There's a whole lot of fix my gun, repair the part, in some cases clean my gun, put a scope on my gun, these sorts of things that go on in gunsmithing, that sort of the what keeps the lights on, it's the things that keeps you busy day in and day out, the more common tasks. So with that addressed, I would like to move on to what is it that SDI offers, right? So to sort of cut to the chase. SDI is not alone in terms of being an online gunsmithing school. The way that generally works is you pay them an amount of money. In the SDI's case, it's a pretty extreme amount of money, but they will take your GI Bill, which I think is probably the most legitimate criticism of them. Is it's kind of obvious what they're doing, especially with the way that they end up having their stuff marketed through, I don't want to say necessarily vet bro YouTubers, but that sort of thing, to sort of get these people who are young and impressionable coming out of the military, frankly the most vulnerable part of their lives, and telling them, look, you can get a job doing this stuff, and pump the brakes on that. We'll probably talk about that more later, but that's a terrifying way to see that marketed. But essentially what SDI will do is take your money or your GI Bill. They'll send you some course materials, and I have been sent the entire list of SDI's course materials from 2023. The quality of the reading material itself, I think, is actually not bad. It's fairly informative. It gives you the basics. The stuff that SDI themselves have authored is quite good. They also send you a bunch of books that I guess they've purchased rights to be able to republish and share with their students. Most of that stuff is pretty good quality. I've seen some criticism where it says that they think like sketchy YouTube videos and like sketchy articles are used as course materials. I also, that's in there. It's definitely true. That's not the extent of the course material though. A lot of the course material is good, and if you went out of your way to teach yourself all the course material, it's not a bad fundamental background from a standpoint of the skills and practices and things you need to know to be a gunsmith. They've got a pretty good grasp on most of that stuff. Now, where the trouble comes in is that a fundamental understanding of all the things, most of the things, right, most of the tasks involved in gunsmithing, does not translate into an actual ability to do any gunsmithing work at all. And SDI tries to get around this by having sort of like a seminal thing that, sort of to wrap up the way the class works, a seminar, what have you. And the way that works is you've got your core project, right? The actual physical thing you work on. So if you want to do the 1911 class, they'll give you a 1911 parts kit and an 80% frame and have you put it together. Similar story with ARs. They've got one for black powder stuff. I understand they've now got drone classes, and I assume it's a similar sort of thing. The problem is this is very limited in scope, and it's done remote, so you don't have an instructor like watching over your shoulder and telling you what to do. You're sort of just following instructions. So it's more, could I be an assembly line worker at a gun factory than am I a gunsmith? Because there's a part of gunsmithing that I think is more art than it is science. It's not something that can be taught. It's something that has to be learned. And my best analogy I've been able to come up with this is like, you can graduate from one of the best art colleges in this school, and it means nothing about your ability to be an artist, right? You can graduate, like New York universities, I've read that's good, they have a good art program. You can graduate from their art program and know nothing about art. Like, know nothing about actually making art that people would want to buy, right? And, I mean, your art, frankly, might look like garbage, right? Just to be able to graduate, you don't really have to be able to make good art. You just have to sort of be able to convince professors that it's maybe good. And so I think the sort of overlap and analogy there is you can graduate with SDI and know jack shit about actually doing gunsmithing. You just have to pass the tests, which, I've seen the tests. You can guess your way through. I mean, I was able to guess my way through them, right? Where it's like, there's maybe one question here I don't know the answer to, and it's because, they're asking a question the way they wanted it phrased. No, the passing SDI's tests is like hilariously easy. And I think that's probably an issue, and if a gunsmithing school were to exist and be feasible, I think letter grades and tests and reciting information is probably the stupidest way to evaluate that. It's got to be in the quality of your work, right? The quality of the work, the capability of the capability of you to do quality work, as well as how quickly you can do it, how much you mess stuff up, right? Because at the end of the day, gunsmithing is much like painting an art, right? Things get messed up, and it's your ability to hide your mess ups that makes sets a not good gunsmith apart from, wow, you're a great gunsmith, and it's like, well, I'm a not so great gunsmith that's good at hiding my mess ups, and that's what sort of makes you a better gunsmith, is either avoiding those mess ups or getting good at hiding them. So that's sort of a fundamental thing that's lacking in SDI's curriculum, is you don't really get much of that at all. And I think that's an important thing, and I think there is where sort of the scam or sort of the deceit lies, is that you can get a degree from SDI, and if a gunsmith's like looking to hire you, like bring on extra help, a gun store is looking to bring on a gunsmith, you don't know anything. Like if they put an AR in front of you and you haven't touched an AR yet, I don't think SDI's course materials have given you enough to actually understand how to do it without you just, I don't think you're better prepared than if you hadn't done SDI at all, from a standpoint of you've got no exposure and experience to it. Whenever people bring up these points, whenever I brought them up in the past, people's gut reaction is to say, okay, well, what do you recommend instead? What should I do instead? Isn't this just the best thing? And I understand that knee-jerk reaction is sort of one of, like, where else do we go, right? Like, you've said our prophet is false. Now what? My answer to that has always been, based in my own personal experience, right? Where I have no formal gunsmith training or anything like that at all. I know a lot. I know a number of gunsmiths just sort of through my connections before I started printing guns, and then after printing guns, right? You come into contact with a lot of them. And I've talked about this basic subject with several of them, and more or less, I'd say like better than 50% of the time, the gunsmiths you run into, the gunsmiths who you feel okay calling gunsmiths, right? That they do good work, that you come across, learned gunsmithing on their own. right? It was something that they picked up because they were interested in a gun or guns in general or building guns, repairing guns. They just started doing it. And they did it enough, they got to the point where it's like, well, shit, I'm actually kind of good at this. I've got the tools to do it, so maybe I'll just start doing it. And either it becomes a business or you get hired on as a part of a gun shop. And probably the remainder of those sort of success stories that I've heard have been people that apprenticed with gunsmiths. And this is something that gunsmithing is a dying trade from a standpoint of like every town having a gunsmith isn't so necessary anymore. You could point to a million different things. I don't necessarily believe that it's just because guns are more durable or reliable these days. I think it's more that people don't want to customize as much because the manufacturer is doing more of that customizing themselves than they did in the day. Like back in the 80s, if you wanted a good 1911, you bought a Colt and you took it to a gunsmith, and that's how you got a good 1911. You couldn't buy out of the box a really nice 1911. You got a Colt, you put as much as that gun was worth again back into the gun in modifications, and then you had a great gun. That was a very popular thing, and it drove demand for a lot of gunsmiths to be around. These days you can buy a lot of really good 1911s that don't need to see a gunsmith ever, and that complicates that relationship significantly, drives down the demand for gunsmith. So apprenticing with a gunsmith is much more difficult these days. If you have the opportunity to do it, I would say that's probably the best way to become a gunsmith. Because that's so rare, though, what I would recommend you do if you're interested in it, here's the secret. It's not really expensive to start building guns. It doesn't even have to be 3D printed, right? Like I would advocate you get into 3D printing because I think that's the easiest and cheapest way to figure out if you actually like building guns or not. Especially before you spend $20,000 or your GI Bill. Getting into 3, it's really cheap. Print a couple of guns and see if it's fun. If you don't enjoy the troubleshooting, you're not going to enjoy being a gunsmith. It's probably just the way it is, and that's okay, right? You don't have to like being a gunsmith. There's no requirement for that. And I think some people figure that out too late. That the actual art, the problem-solving process involved in gunsmithing is something that people don't expect to be in place, and then they run into it and they're like, this kind of sucks. It feels like school again. And I thought I just get to shoot guns all the time, and I actually shoot guns less than if I wasn't a gunsmith. This is kind of awful. So I think that's worth keeping in mind there. So in this vein of wanting to become a gunsmith, like I said, I recommend you get a 3D printer and figure it out. If that's something you've already done, right, and you're maybe interested in what the next step is, because at this point in time, I don't think the 3D printing gun industry is nearly big enough that 3D printed gun-specific gunsmiths are needed, especially since that community is sort of built around doing it yourself anyway. So if you're interested in that next step, generally what I'd recommend is like AKs or HK-style roller guns. Both of them have kits that are fairly cheap. AKs are getting more expensive these days. There's those Cole Arms AK kits that are cheap, and they're good enough quality you can learn to put AKs together with them, and they have they have problems, right? And you can read about their problems online. The problems that you'll run into on them will better prepare you for more gunsmithing in the future, so they're good for learning gunsmithing, which isn't a shining endorsement of an AK kit, but it is what it is. There's those, as well as Set Me C kits, still really cheap. I don't necessarily think Set Me L kits are as great a value for learning these things, but G3 kits, Set Me C kits right now, they're really cheap. You will learn a ton of gunsmithing skills putting those guns together. It's not hard from a standpoint of the actual acumen that's required of you isn't actually that high, but you will have to be patient. You will have to mess things up, and you will have to learn things. If you have no experience using a press, no experience using a welder, no experience gunsmithing in general, you will mess up your first gun bad. It will suck. And that's just how it goes. You shouldn't feel bad about that. You shouldn't get frustrated and scream and quit gunsmithing forever because of that. You should learn what you can first time, but the second one will be so much better. And the third one will be better yet. And the fourth one will be better yet. And then you're like 100 roller guns deep, and it's like, wow, this is so easy. I used to think bolt gapping was hard, and I was pulling my hair out about it, and now it turns out it's super easy. It's not hard at all. You can do it like lickety split. At this point, I can bolt gap a bolt carrier group in like 5-10 minutes. I've got a process set up, a whole assembly line in the garage. It's really easy once you learn what you can and develop your process. And I think that's a big part of what gunsmithing is really about, is you sort of bring over the skill set of a manufacturing or mechanical engineer, sort of a combination of the two. And especially if you've got a 3D printer, you start 3D printing yourself custom tools to make some of these jobs easier. And I think that's sort of where the problem solving really comes in, is that the people who do these things and make tutorials for doing these things online will have very specific tools that maybe you won't have, but it's finding out how to make the tools that you have do the job that you need while also understanding that sometimes you don't have the tools to do the job you need, and knowing when you just need to go buy a tool. And that's a big part of gunsmithing, I would say. From a standpoint of, I know people like to ask, like, recommended tools. It really depends on the sort of thing that you're trying to do. A press, like a 20-ton, 12-ton or 20-ton Harbor Freight press, is sort of a requirement if you want to be a gunsmith. They're not expensive. It's a really good tool to get. Not expensive, not hard to find. Just get one. People always ask mills and lathes. Mills and lathes are expensive these days. Coronavirus really ruined the mill lathe. Like the Chinese import mill lathe market was doing good. Grizzlies are expensive now. If you can find something usable, local, get that. Like used Bridgeports, used South Bends are a great value. Facebook marketplaces where you look to find those. Can't always find them though. Grizzly stuff is still good. Their warranty's good. Their customer support is good. But their machines are like twice the price they were 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So price has gone up quite a bit. I have a Grizzly mill drill machine. It's the G704. I love it. I learned machining with it actually. And I think machining is a core part of gunsmithing that's important to understand. At the very least, from a standpoint of what it is and how it works. And admittedly, SDI does a good job of explaining what the various machining machines are, how to use them, and not necessarily how to use them. Let's back up. It doesn't really tell you how to use them. It sort of tells you how they're used and what they're good for, what they're capable of, and what you should do as far as because you don't need these machines necessarily to learn how they work. You can watch videos, and Titans of CNC it's sort of like hyperactive Zoomer brain content for the most part, but a lot of the information they have in there is really good, and I recommend you watch some of their videos to see the differences in machines. They're using a lot of CNC stuff, right? It's in the name, but manual machines or CNC machines where you're the computer is one way to think about it. So seeing the different kinds of machines, especially if you keep it to 3 axes, right? So it's your mills that can go up and down, left and right, backwards and forward, and your lathes that spin and then go, your bed goes in and out and up and down. So become familiar with your 3-axis milling machines, lathes and milling machines, and become familiar with the sort of cuts they can make. Then take yourself something like a 1911, take it down to its individual parts. Look at all of the parts and think, how would I make this with that machine? Understanding things from a machinist mindset is very important, I think, to being a full suite gunsmith, if you will. You don't actually have to understand how to make parts out of metal to be a gunsmith, if you ask me. But being a better gunsmith, I think, involves that, because eventually you're going to find a part you have to modify. Eventually it will happen. And understanding how these machines work can help you modify the part, or help you make a different version of the part, or make you a tool to help you modify the part. Lots of skills that can come in there. So understanding at least how these machines work is important to being a gunsmith. If you can spend the money, spare the money, get a milling machine or a lathe. Which you get sort of depends on what you want to do. If you want to do more firing pin barrel stuff, round stuff with constant profiles, that's what lathes are for. If you're thinking more, if you're thinking more like pockets and milling and this sort of thing, that's obviously what a mill is for. So sort of think about learn how the machines work, think about the sort of cuts each machine can make, then get a machine based off of that. I will add, you can do a substantial amount of lathe work when it comes to like firing pins or retaining pins or these sorts of things. You can make those on a mill. It's just a little haphazard. I made a firing pin for a shotgun that's long out of production recently, just using a mill and some 4140 steel stock. It's entirely possible, and again, it's just that problem-solving skill set. And it's eventually, at some rate, you have to have one of these machines that is yours that you can screw around with and break. Or if you're apprenticing somewhere, or you're learning somewhere, your boss should understand, right? If you're apprenticing as a gunsmith, your boss should understand you're going to break a lot of shit. Just break it, right? Figure out what works, figure out what doesn't. And a very important part of becoming a gunsmith is breaking stuff. You will break stuff. If you're not breaking stuff, you're not really gunsmithing. If you're not really bubbling up, if you're not fucking a gun up really good, you're not really doing gunsmithing yet. It's not until you fuck the gun up, you understand why you fucked it up, and you know what you're going to do next time to maybe avoid that, that you're not really engaged in the whole becoming a gunsmith. If you ask me anyway. When it comes to sort of less machine tools, right, less specific tools, sort of the general tools every gunsmith should have. A good gunsmithing screwdriver set. Very important. This one wasn't terribly expensive. I think I got it off of Amazon. There will be these sets that have like 60,000 little bits that you can put in there. I recommend you stay away from those unless you're also like, if you take watches apart to do retro video games, you'll need these same sort of bits for taking controllers apart eventually. You'll need the million different bits. I recommend you stick with good quality bits instead, and spend like $40 on a set like this. That's a good value. The ones that are like $60 for 20,000 bits, they are not very well made bits, and you're going to break them, and you're going to have a hard time with them, and it's not going to be fun. And so once you have one of these sets, of course you can buy extra bits from Grace or from other places, right? But you'll run into instances with these bits where you have to modify them. So you can see this one, you might be able to see. I had to grind a little bit of thickness out of it because that was, I believe, a screw on a German shotgun that didn't fit any of the other screwdriver sizes. It's important to know, especially with old guns, they didn't have standardized screw sizes the way we do today. Like they had a shaper that like put a slot in a screw, and that's the size the screw was whatever size that insert was that day. So you'll run into times that you'll need to make tools, and getting comfortable making tools or modifying tools is a big part of the learning curve. It's something that you should become familiar with and comfortable with, learning how to make tools. So a good screwdriver set with your flat ground instead of most flat screwdriver bits are actually tapered. You want ones that are flat ground. Taper is a regular screwdriver. Gunsmithing screwdrivers are flat taper. So you can see it's straight out there as opposed to it being tapered like this. You don't want taper bits because they will tear up gun screws and you won't get the screws out. With the proper bits, screws will come right out. Important thing to have if you want to be involved in gunsmithing. And yep, sure enough, the old trusty dusty Dremel tool. I don't think you can get around being a gunsmith without a Dremel tool. If you don't have a Dremel tool, you have a tool that does a Dremel tool's job that you don't call a Dremel tool because you're embarrassed to say you own one. Dremel tools are extremely useful. Just some sort of rotary tool, very important. Sort of the attachments you use, there's lots of different attachments. You should use the different attachments and find what works for you for various jobs. So again, a part of the learning, part of the problem solving. I like using cutoff wheels for as much as I can. I get a bunch of cheap cutoff wheels off of Amazon, and I use them incorrectly because you're only supposed to cut on the edge. Which brings me to safety glasses. By far and away the most important thing to be a gunsmith. There has been probably 10 times in my life gunsmithing on stuff that if I wouldn't have lost an eye, I would have had something sharp in my eye if I didn't have safety glasses. Guys, it's important. Wear safety glasses when you work on guns. It's just a good idea. But yeah, I use cutoff wheels the wrong way because you're supposed to only cut on the edge, and probably the reason I've had things come at me 10 times or so many times is because I'll take threaded rods against the flat part of the cutting disc because it still cuts, and you can polish stuff up that way. It's a little bit of a gimmicky hack, but it works so well that I won't stop doing it. Cratexes. Cratexes come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but Cratexes are sort of your best friend for gunsmithing when it comes to polishing stuff up. It's essentially just polishing compound bound to rubber that you spin on a Dremel tool, and you can make metal very shiny and you can see your reflection in it. Very useful for polishing feed ramps and these sorts of things. Deburring stuff, extremely useful little tools. Next up, and these are tools that you should be careful with, but carbide burrs. It's really easy to mess stuff up with carbide burrs because they want to slip and slide all over when you use them with the Dremel tools. You need to have a wrist. Ideally, you have the workpiece held in a vise. A vise is a really good thing to have as a gunsmith. Multiple vices. I don't know if you can have enough. It's nice to have a couple of machining vices, a couple of the jaw style vices, like the regular benchtop vices that you're used to seeing. It's good to have vices that are held down to tables. It's good to have vices that aren't, right? Because it's useful to be able to move a vice over, put it at an angle by putting it up on a wedge. Again, there's problem solving involved in gunsmithing. You will have to learn how to solve problems. But these little tools are good at causing problems, but then also still sometimes good at solving them. And it's essentially just a little selection of carbide burrs. You can grind away at metal by hand, do very intricate work with them. Just important to be careful with them, and then doubly careful. Some of these will make the worst metal splinters you've ever seen, and you'll do some work with it and then forget what you were doing. Think you're done doing work, and then the next time you go to wash your hands, your hand will just feel like it's on fire. And you'll look, and you've just got like 50 metal splinters in your hand because that flames them into them. So I don't necessarily recommend wearing gloves because wearing gloves around rotary tools can be bad for you. It's just one of those things where you have to be careful. And a vacuum, a little shop vac, invaluable tool. Get a shop vac. Have a shop vac. Shop vac up metal burrs. I probably should shop vac up this loose gunpowder that's been sitting on the workbench for a while, but very useful thing to have, right, is a shop vac. Shop vac's good to have. Carbide burrs are good to have. especially if you're not going to have a milling machine. There's a lot of operations that would ordinarily require a milling machine that you can just sort of butcher with a carbide burr, but you can still get the job done with a carbide burr. And then you take a couple of Cratexes and polish it up to make it look like you totally machined it. Of course, I'm part joking, but part not. I'm sure most gunsmiths would agree, there's times when you're gunsmithing when it's not going to fit on a mill, or it's not going to go right on a mill, or you need that level of precision that your wrist can give you that on a mill is difficult, or you're spending a week writing a CNC program and you don't have a week. When it comes to woodworking, right, admittedly woodworking is one of my, not one of my fortes. I don't do a lot of it. All I do is put stocks that are cracked back together. Little brass screws, wet brass threaded rods essentially, are very good for this. There's companies that sell specific custom made ones for like $1 a brass rod. I think this was from McMaster, and these were like 5 cents a brass rod. It's essentially just a brass rod. You chuck it up, you pilot drill the hole to cinch a stock back together. You pilot drill the hole. You take one of these rods chucked up in a drill and you just screw it in. Then you grind off both heads of the rod, and then you use acro glass. You put acro glass in the hole beforehand, of course, but you use acro glass or epoxy of some sort to glue the stock back together on the threads of the rod. You put the rod in there and it's cinched back up. You can use, having speedy clamps, the little plastic clamps that you can squeeze that cinch stuff down. Very useful for repairing stocks. And this is the big acro glass kit. You can see I've got a pretty good amount of use out of it because I've got a lot of shotguns. And anytime I have a shotgun that has a cracked stock, just because I've got the acro glass, I go ahead and glue it back together. Sometimes that's not necessary, but a lot of gunsmithing work that you will, if you're able to repair stocks, you will multiply the amount of gunsmithing work that you can take in substantially. So there you go, acro glass gel. I kind of like regular acro glass better than the gel because the gel is hard to get into crevices. But if you mix it up so it's a little bit more hardener than it is the actual stuff, it will still set up hard and stick well, but it'll be a little bit more gooey if you use more hardener, which is a little counterintuitive. But you can just put it on your finger and nap it over a crack, and eventually it will seep into the crack because you're napping it in there. Sort of like tuck pointing if you're familiar with doing a grout or bricklaying. But an acro glass kit is, good to have, right? Especially if you've got a shotgun already that has a cracked stock. Worth having. If you're interested in learning how to fix shotgun stocks, here's the coolest thing. You can buy shotguns with cracked stocks on Gunbroker for like $150 because their stock is cracked, and a new stock costs as much as those guns themselves are worth. So buy some crappy shotguns that have cracked stocks. Learn how to glue stocks back together. Go and shoot it and see if the stock holds up. If it doesn't, see what you need to change about your approach to make it do better. There's tips and tricks, of course, about all the things I'm talking about you can learn from YouTube, but the only way to actually learn what works and what doesn't is do it yourself. So buy a shotgun, glue it back together, see what happens. It's kind of fun. I guess another subject that should be addressed is refinishing. Refinishing is not my forte. I've used hot salt bluing setups before. It's an exhausting process. It's one of those where if you were running a full-scale gunsmith shop where you're hot bluing stuff frequently, right? You can wait a week and let a week's worth of guns pile up and hot blue. Do that. It's a money printing machine at that point. But if you're only going to be like rebluing 1 gun a month or 2 guns a year or 5 guns a year or something like this, don't get involved. Don't get invested in hot salt bluing. Wait until you have that work before you invest in the setup because it is a difficult setup to use. The learning curve isn't bad, but it's certainly one of those things where you will have to learn. Like you right now, if you haven't done it, have no conception of how much work you can put into polishing a gun so that you can get the bluing to look like 90% as good as what Browning was just crapping out on their crap production guns. The guns they're shitting out, they were getting their bluing looking near perfect. You're not going to be able to do that without a ton of practice. And so learning that is of course something you'll have to do, but the actual getting hot salt bluing set up isn't that difficult. Having a bottle of cold blue isn't a bad thing as a gunsmith. Just know that cold blue looks bad. Brownells has a Smithbusters, I think, or like a 101 video about cold blue that I think is worth a watch. The different kinds of cold blue will give you different kinds of results on different kinds of steel. There's definitely a learning curve there. Cold blue isn't that, it's not horrendous to do for touch-up, but gunsmiths will know to look at a gun and look for cold blue. And you can smell cold blue on a gun. Even like years after it's been applied, you can smell when a gun's been cold blued. And so I'm not a gigantic fan of cold bluing stuff. Refinishing in general, I think, is best left to if you have the demand, right, to do the rate. It's a money printer, right? You just keep sticking guns in the bluing tanks, and then moving them over tank to tank is essentially the hardest it gets at that point. Like turning the tanks on so they get hot in the morning, so that by the early afternoon they're actually ready to use. That's all that there is to it. But short of having that level of demand, it's not something you can teach yourself. But bluing setups are really expensive, so it's not something that I recommend you get involved with. This is one thing where if you're apprenticing at a gunsmith that already has that demand, one of the most valuable things you can learn then, refinishing guns. It's something that there is demand for constantly. It's something that takes a very high level, right? Because you've absolutely crossed from science into like it's all art at that point. There's nothing you're doing there that's science. It's just art. You're making a gun look nice. It's artistic. It's expressive. It involves your skill with putting your figurative paintbrush to your figurative canvas at that point. So it's something worth learning. But these days with Cerakoting, it's close to painting at that point. There's certainly those sort of finishes are something you can experiment with and can get good with, and most people these days are just looking for good Cerakote jobs. Certainly learn to Cerakote on, learn to mess up your stuff before you mess up a customer's, because sort of gunsmithing is one of those things where there's nothing more expensive than losing your reputation. There's nothing more unobtainable than buying it back. Fucking up customers' guns is bad. Don't fuck up the customer's guns. Fuck up enough of your guns so that you're comfortable either A, you're either comfortable not fucking up the customer's gun because it won't happen, or you're so comfortable because you fucked up so many of yours that you understand if you fuck up the customers, you know exactly how to fix it and they'll never tell. So that's sort of the situation there. Is it's important to learn to do this stuff on your own before you ruin your reputation and you'll never be allowed to be a gunsmith again. That's something that I feel obliged to mention, because there are all sorts of horror stories, right, where gunsmiths will say, yeah, I know how to repair shotgun ribs, and they 6 screws into the top of the barrel to reattach a shotgun rib. Like, I don't know where you went to gunsmithing school. Must have been SDI. No, screwing shotgun ribs on is not right. And that sort of brings us to what I'm going to describe as being the more arcane gunsmithing techniques, right, where it's welding and soldering. There's a lot of soldering in older guns that goes on. It's not nearly as popular these days, but even into the 60s, 70s, 80s, soldering was huge on guns. Shotgun ribs are typically attached through soldering. Double barrel shotguns, frequently the 2 barrels are actually 2 separate barrels and they just get soldered together with lead solder. Learning how to do that sort of work is important if you're interested in taking in that kind of work. Again, it's something that there's always demand for. There's always people who want a rib put on their shotgun. They want a rib that's coming off repaired. All these sorts of things. So it's very similar to plumbing soldering, actually, from a standpoint of you flux the joint, you solder it, you feed in the solder, only then with a gun you've got to clean up the excess solder. All right, I think this wraps up most of what I was going to say. I didn't want to get too much into specifics because A, I'd kind of like to have this video be on YouTube, and we'll see how they feel about that. But B, I just sort of wanted to get my thoughts out there without getting too deep into the weeds. Maybe eventually, if people are interested, I can do videos about the tools I use, but I tend to find these sorts of videos counterproductive, because you'll see people who look up to a particular gunsmith, and then they want to get the tools they use, and then they get the tools they use, and it turns out it doesn't work for them, or it's not productive for them, or it doesn't fit with the way that they want to do work. And so I think that, again, comes back to my point. If you're going to take anything away from this video, it's that don't pay for SDI. Don't pay for any online gunsmithing school. If you're going to spend $20,000 on gunsmithing, here's how you spend it. Buy a lathe from Grizzly, buy a mill from Grizzly, buy like 20 parts kits, put them together. Start crapping guns together. If the guns actually go together well enough, then get an FFL and start selling guns, and you're a gunsmith, right? You can start having your hobby pay for itself at that point. But short of that, the lesson here, right? Don't pay for SDI. Gunsmithing isn't hard to get into. You can just start doing it. You don't have to ask. You don't need a license. You can just start doing it. Of course, there's some states that say that if you're making frames or receivers, you need this license or that license, right? So be aware of that. But it's not hard to get into. Besides that, you can just start doing it. You don't have to ask anybody. You can just start messing up guns as much as you want. Nobody can stop you. There's tools that you should have. It's a learning process. It's an art. It's an art just like painting is an art. There's going to be frustration that comes with it. It's up to you if you want to deal with that frustration or not. I think it's rewarding to overcome that frustration. I really do. But I understand some people are looking for something that's much more relaxing outlet than that. I would not call gunsmithing a particularly relaxing outlet. It's one of those, like painting. Again, I think there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. But much aside from that, don't be afraid to. What's the saying from Magic School Bus? It's make mistakes, get messy, make guns, something like that. That should be your motto, I think. Just get involved with it, get doing it, and by the time you've done it, I mean, the internet sort of become like the de facto way to market your talent as a gunsmith. I'm familiar with several gunsmiths who have successful careers and businesses now because they started posting the little gunsmith projects that they did at home for themselves on the internet, and it worked out well for them. That's certainly not a guarantee, but you build yourself, as it were, your resume, right? Because that's the cool thing about being a gunsmith is you get to market yourself like an artist. Like, here's my art. Would you like my art? I can make that art for you. And gun shops can hire you, or you can work for yourself. You can take gunsmithing work through the internet. Any of these things are options. So keep your horizons open. That's sort of how you become a gunsmith on your own. I wanted to come to the end of this video to bring up this point, though. If you're the kind of person who doesn't learn on your own, you're the kind of person who cannot sit down and learn to do something. You're sort of seeking, I don't want to say instant gratification in a bad way, but you're a person who needs instant gratification, right? That somebody has to give you the thing so that you can do the thing. Some people are like this, and I frankly think that it's the fault of our education system that makes people like this, that they crush that creativity that makes humans great. But if you have had your creativity completely destroyed by the American public school system, and you need a formal education background to learn these things, as much as I hate to say it, you gotta learn math, and you gotta go become a mechanical engineer or become a machinist. Both of them you'll have to know math for. It will probably be less math to be the machinist, but the math that you're learning you actually have to understand. Whereas to be a mechanical engineer, you can forget 90% of that shit that you learn in order to graduate anyway, right? Like, you don't have to remember what happened last year. It's just a different calculus class this year. Whereas if you're a machinist, you'll be learning a lot of trig in this stuff. But if you forget it, you're not employable. You're not going to graduate. So get a degree in machining. Get a degree in mechanical engineering if you're more interested in the engineering side of gunsmithing, the making new stuff side. Mechanical engineering is probably going to benefit you more. If you're interested more in the fixing things, making new parts for things that exist, these sorts of things, like your core fundamental skill set, going to mechanical engineering, or rather machining school, right, a trade school, or, I mean, there are 4-year machining degrees at this point. Right? Manufacturing engineering sort of gives you that. Frankly, I don't think that's a bad bet. It's not a bad idea. If all else goes to shit, you have a degree that's employable. Whereas, like, if you can't be a gunsmith with a gunsmithing degree, what can you be? Burger flipper, something like that. Not to denigrate burger flippers, certainly. If we're to have a caste system, I'm putting burger flippers above a lot of other people, like politicians and lawyers and these sorts, doctors, maybe some doctors. But that's sort of my gut feeling on that, is that if you need public education, right, an education system to teach you these things, and you're not going to learn them yourselves, I think the framework for that exists in machining, either trade school or 4-year. Mechanical engineering is a 4-year. Don't get a master's degree to do gunsmithing. Go back and get a master's if you're going to do something else, but for the love of God, you don't need a master's degree to do gun engineering. There's not that much going on in most guns anyway. But that's sort of the rundown. That's my thoughts on this. I guess if you're a gunsmitherino already, you can let me know how stupid I am in the comments or whatever. If it's helpful, you can say that it did a 1 help. I guess if you guys are interested in more insight into the particular gunsmithing I do, I guess I've already said I'm not going to do, like, here's my tools and this is what you should buy. I'm not trying to say that. I'm only ever going to speak in generalities on that, because I think otherwise I'm sort of crippling your ability to be creative. But if there's sort of particular topics on this that you guys like to learn about, I always like to talk. I'm good at talking. And I guess secondary to that, I'm hoping to eventually have a series that might explore not necessarily the ideas of gunsmithing in particular, but tangential to the series, I'm looking at the development of shotguns, right? Particular shotguns. And I want to do a series about those shotguns. But as a part of that, I'm going to talk about the things that I had to do to fix the shotguns, and so maybe a little bit of gunsmithing lessons will bleed in there. But I guess that's something to look forward to in the future. But if there's any of this sort of content that you guys like, let me know. I guess I've got a Patreon now. That's new. I don't know what what's going on necessarily at Utreon, but they've been slow to respond, and my videos haven't been syncing there for a while. So I went ahead and made a Patreon, and that's in the cope above, like the cope sections down here in the videos here. In the middle there is where you can go to the Patreon, and then if you're in the Patreon, you can tell me to make videos too. Anyway, I hope you guys have a good day. Hopefully somebody at least found this useful, and have a good time with the guns.